You never know when inspiration will invade your soul. The local Arts Council sponsored a performance by the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. The guest conductor was announced to be David Amram, a musician I had not yet heard of. The pre-concert publicity identified Mr. Amram as a young composer-conductor who had shocked the classical world by composing orchestral jazz and even performing as jazz soloist from the conductor's podium. Shocking indeed for 1973. This was a performance I had to see and hear for myself. Verbal descriptions of music are difficult, if not impossible, to translate. But what I heard shook my naive concept of modern music. Stylistically, Mr. Amram's orchestral compositions could only be described as avant-garde, well beyond my comprehension and experience. While I had heard examples of orchestral jazz, that term usually meant there was a jazz trio on stage accompanied by a symphony orchestra. When it was time for a little jazz, the trio of piano, bass, and drums would improvise. When it was time for a little classical, the orchestra would take over the reins from the trio. Rarely would the trio and orchestra interact musically. It was understood that classical musicians couldn't play jazz, and jazz musicians couldn't play classical. Yet in David's music, the first obvious sign of a novel approach was the lack of a jazz trio on stage. Rather, there was an unmistakable thread of jazz rhythm, harmony, and improvisation weaving and meandering through each section of the orchestra, sometimes obvious, more often subtle. As surprised as I was to see David lift his French horn to his lips as jazz soloist from the podium, the orchestra providing its complex interplay, I could only laugh out loud when he actually pulled a penny whistle from his pocket as his solo instrument on another piece. What a gimmick, I thought. But the real surprise came when he played the penny whistle with a level of musicianship one would expect from the likes of Bird or Dizzy. I had met David briefly before the concert, having been introduced to him as the new music teacher at the local community college. After the performance, I'm afraid I embarrassed myself royally when I literally ran up onto the stage, shook his hand much too forcefully, and shouted, "You really are one son of a..." You see, for me that was the ultimate compliment to pay to a master musician, a bit of lingo common in my world. Unfortunately, it was all too apparent the lingo wasn't common in his world. He looked at me, unsure whether he should hit me or thank me. "Why would you call me that?" he asked uncomfortably. "Oh man, I'm sorry, David. To me, that's the ultimate compliment. It means I dug your music more than I can put into words." He admonished me with his eyes. "Okay then, thank you, I think. Oh, and you're a real son of a... too." Touché. The next day, I was inspired to go out and buy a recorder. No, not a tape recorder, a musical instrument called a recorder, like grammar school kids learn to play as their first grade introduction to music. I thought about buying a penny whistle, but it seemed too obvious a sellout to copy something David had already done. So I bought a recorder, assuming that mastering it would be kids' play. I was dismayed that it took me several weeks of non-stop practice to master the instrument to the point of daring to play it in a musical setting. But as I learned the ins and outs of the recorder, I began to conceptualize the next concert appearance of the college jazz ensemble. Experiencing David's concert had inspired me to approach performance from the perspective of a big picture canvas, not merely a series of small picture snapshots. In other words, a concert could be one continuous encounter with the audience, each section a link in the chain of the overall musical structure, each connected to the one before it and the one after it. At the time, a number of rock artists were experimenting with such big picture performances and recordings, but this style wouldn't really take hold for many more years.